You and your family are a disgrace to America. AOC's voice rang through the studio as Eric Trump's expression changed. But then what he said would have the entire country talking. The CNN studio lights blazed with an intensity that matched the political fire about to ignite. It was a crisp October evening in 2025, and what was supposed to be a routine policy debate about economic inequality was about to become the most explosive political confrontation of the year. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 34, sat poised in her burgundy blazer, her dark hair perfectly styled, eyes sharp with the kind of determination that had made her one of the most recognizable faces in progressive politics. Across from her, Eric Trump, 41, adjusted his navy blue tie with the confident precision of someone born into wealth and power, his blonde hair slicked back in the Trump family style. The moderator, CNN's Anderson Cooper, had introduced this as a discussion about economic policy and American values. But everyone in that studio, sensed they were about to witness something far more explosive. The audience of 200 invited guests represented a cross-section of American political thought, progressive activists, conservative donors, undecided voters, and political junkies who live for moments like this. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation as the hashtag #OCSEric began trending before the debate even officially started. What none of them knew was that AOC had come prepared with more than just talking points. Hidden in her phone was a recording that would change everything, a piece of evidence so damaging it would rock the Trump family to its core and forever alter the trajectory of American politics. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the explosive political drama we cover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. This wasn't just another political debate. This was the moment when America's economic divide collided with its political dynasties, live on national television. Eric Trump had spent the weeks leading up to this debate positioning himself as the reasonable voice of the Trump legacy. Unlike his more volatile father or his headline-grabbing brother Don Jr., Eric had cultivated an image as the businessman of the family, the one who understood economic policy beyond mere slogans. At 41, he stood tall at 6 feet 5 inches, his presence commanding any room he entered. His years running the Trump organization had given him a polished corporate demeanor that played well on television. Eric's supporters saw him as the future of conservative economics, someone who could articulate free market principles without the bombastic rhetoric that had defined his father's presidency. He had been making the rounds on financial news shows, presenting himself as a serious policy thinker who understood both business and governance. Tonight's debate was supposed to be his coming-out moment as a legitimate political voice, separate from the Trump brand's more controversial elements. But Eric Trump harbored a secret that would soon be exposed in the most public way possible. Behind his polished exterior lay the same arrogance and entitlement that had defined his family for generations. His private conversations revealed a man who viewed politics as a game to be won rather than a responsibility to be honored. And tonight, those private thoughts would become very public indeed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez represented everything Eric Trump's base loved to hate. Born in the Bronx to a working-class Puerto Rican family, she had worked as a bartender while studying economics at Boston University. Her meteoric rise from serving drinks to serving in Congress had made her a symbol of progressive possibility and conservative frustration. At 34, she was young enough to represent a new generation of leadership, but experienced enough to have survived 5 years of intense political combat. AOC supporters saw her as the voice of economic justice, someone who understood struggle because she had lived it. Her Green New Deal had sparked national conversations about climate change and economic inequality. Her social media presence had redefined how politicians could communicate directly with constituents. But her critics dismissed her as a radical socialist whose policies would destroy American prosperity. What made AOC particularly dangerous to the Trump family was her background as an economics major combined with her experience as a working-class American. She could speak both the language of policy and the language of struggle, making her arguments accessible to voters who might otherwise tune out political debates. Tonight, She would use both skills to devastating effect. The stage was set for more than just a policy debate. This was a collision between two visions of America: Eric's inherited privilege versus AOC's earned position, corporate conservatism versus progressive populism, establishment power versus insurgent energy. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, and both participants knew that this debate could define their political futures. As the cameras rolled, and Anderson Cooper welcomed viewers to what he called a crucial conversation about America's economic future, neither Eric Trump nor Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could have anticipated that this night would become one of the most talked-about political moments of the decade. The recording on AOC's phone was about to change everything. Anderson Cooper opened the debate with what seemed like a softball question about tax policy, but the tension in the room was immediately apparent. Eric Trump, confident in his business background, launched into a familiar conservative talking point about how tax cuts for corporations create jobs and economic growth. His voice carried the authority of someone who had grown up in boardrooms, discussing policy as if it were as simple as a business transaction. The reality that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez refuses to acknowledge, Eric began, his tone condescending from the very first sentence, is that her socialist policies would devastate the American economy. When you punish success through excessive taxation, you discourage the very innovation and entrepreneurship that built this country. The audience murmured appreciatively. At least the conservative section did. Eric's supporters had come to hear this message, the familiar refrain that equated wealth with virtue and poverty with failure. He continued, his confidence growing with each word. My family has created thousands of jobs, built iconic properties, and contributed billions to the American economy. That's real leadership, not the performative politics and economic illiteracy we see from the far left. AOC listened intently, her expression calm, but her eyes flashing with the kind of controlled anger that had made her famous during congressional hearings. She had faced this type of attack countless times before, the suggestion that her working-class background somehow disqualified her from understanding economics, the implication that inherited wealth was a better credential than lived experience. When Cooper turned to her for a response, AOC leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made everyone in the studio pay attention. Mr. Trump, it's interesting that you mentioned creating jobs and contributing to the economy, she began, her tone deceptively measured. Because I think the American people deserve to know the real record of your family's contributions to this country. Eric's confident smile flickered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. By all means, Congresswoman, let's talk about records. My family's success speaks for itself. Does it? AOC's voice sharpened. Because when I look at your family's record, I see multiple bankruptcies, thousands of contractors who were never paid, and a pattern of using the legal system to avoid responsibility for your business failures. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This was getting personal quickly, moving far beyond the policy discussion they had expected. Eric's face reddened slightly, but his years of media training kicked in. That's exactly the kind of misinformation and personal attack that Americans are tired of, he responded, his voice rising. My family has built a business empire while you've spent your career complaining about successful people from the sidelines. Sidelines. AOC's eyebrow raised, and something in her tone suggested Eric had just made a serious mistake. Mr. Trump, before we continue this conversation about who understands the American economy, I think this audience needs to hear something. She reached for her phone, and the atmosphere in the studio immediately changed. Eric's expression shifted from confident to wary as AOC held up the device. This is a recording from 3 weeks ago, she said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. I think it's very relevant to our discussion about economic responsibility and family values. Eric's face went pale. What are you doing? He asked, his voice losing its earlier authority. I'm about to play a conversation that shows exactly what you and your family really think about the American people you claim to serve, AOC replied, her finger hovering over the play button. The studio fell completely silent. Even Anderson Cooper looked surprised by this unexpected turn. The camera zoomed in on both participants, Eric's face a mixture of panic and anger. AOC's expression calm, but determined. This recording was made during a private dinner at Mar-a-Lago. AOC continued. You might want to listen carefully, because your own words are about to expose everything you just said as complete lies. And then she pressed play. The audio quality was crystal clear, filling the studio with voices that everyone immediately recognized. Eric Trump's distinctive tone came through the speakers first, casual and unguarded in a way that was completely different from his polished debate persona. The thing about these working-class voters, Eric's recorded voice said, is they're so easy to manipulate. You just tell them that immigrants are taking their jobs, and that rich people create jobs, and they'll vote against their own interests every time. A second voice, unfamiliar to most, but clearly another wealthy individual, responded, but don't you worry about the economic policies? Some of these tax cuts really do hurt the middle class. Eric's laugh was audible and cold. Who cares? By the time they figure out that our policies made things worse, we'll have made our money and moved on. The beauty of being wealthy is that economic policy never really affects you personally. The studio erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Eric sat frozen in his chair, his face now completely drained of color. The confident businessman who had entered the debate had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely terrified. But the recording wasn't finished. The truth is, Eric's voice continued through the speakers. People like AOC actually understand economics better than most Republicans. Her policies would probably help working families. But we can't let people know that because it would hurt our bottom line. The unknown voice asked, so you're saying her ideas would actually work? Of course they would work. Eric replied, his tone matter of fact. Higher taxes on the wealthy, stronger worker protections, government investment in infrastructure. That's basic economics. It's what built the middle class in the first place. But admitting that doesn't help us stay rich. The recording continued for another devastating minute, with Eric casually discussing how his family had used political connections to avoid paying contractors, how they deliberately structured deals to benefit from bankruptcy laws, and how they viewed working-class Americans as useful idiots who could be convinced to support policies that actively harmed them. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the studio was deafening. Eric Trump, who had entered the debate as a confident representative of conservative economics, now sat slumped in his chair, looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. AOC calmly put her phone back down and looked directly at Eric. So, Mr. Trump, would you like to continue our discussion about economic responsibility? The audience erupted. Some people were on their feet, shouting in anger. Others sat in stunned silence. Conservative viewers who had come to support Eric looked betrayed and furious. Progressive audience members were cheering, but even they seemed shocked by the completeness of Eric's exposure. Anderson Cooper, veteran journalist that he was, struggled to maintain control of the situation. Mr. Trump, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Would you like to respond to what we just heard? Eric attempted to speak several times, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he managed to stammer, that recording, it's taken out of context. It doesn't represent. Out of context, AOC interrupted, her voice now carrying the full force of her anger. Mr. Trump, we just heard you admit that you deliberately lie to voters, that you view working Americans with contempt, and that you know your policies hurt the very people you claim to help. What context could possibly excuse that? Eric's media training finally kicked in, and he attempted to go on the offensive. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You ambush people with selectively edited recordings instead of debating actual policy. Selectively edited? AOC pulled out a folder from beside her chair. Mr. Trump, I have the full recording right here. All 43 minutes of it. Would you like me to play more? Eric's face went from pale to green. Clearly, there was more on that recording, much more. You want to talk about policy? AOC continued, standing up now, her presence commanding the entire studio. Let's talk about the policy of honesty. Let's talk about the policy of actually caring about the people you claim to represent. She turned to face the cameras directly, speaking not just to the studio audience, but to the millions watching at home. What you just heard is everything that's wrong with American politics. We have wealthy individuals who view public service as a game, who see voters as marks to be conned, who know their policies are harmful but promote them anyway because it benefits their bank accounts. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Mr. Trump just admitted on tape that progressive economic policies would actually help working families. He admitted that he lies to voters because the truth would hurt his family's wealth. He admitted that he views the American people with contempt. She turned back to Eric, who was now visibly sweating under the studio lights. So before you ever again question my understanding of economics, before you ever again suggest that your family represents American values, maybe you should ask yourself what you've actually contributed to this country besides lies, exploitation, and contempt for the very people who trusted you. The studio erupted again, but this time it was sustained applause mixed with angry shouts. The conservative section of the audience looked stunned and betrayed, while progressives were on their feet cheering. But perhaps most importantly, the undecided voters in the middle looked disgusted, not just with Eric, but with the entire system that had allowed such cynical manipulation to flourish. Eric Trump attempted one final defense. "You don't understand the complexities of business and economics," he said, his voice desperate now. "Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions." Difficult decisions? AOC's voice rose with righteous indignation. Like the difficult decision to stiff contractors who built your properties? Like the difficult decision to lie to voters about policies you know will hurt them? Like the difficult decision to view working Americans as useful idiots? She gestured toward the audience. These are the people you were just laughing about on that recording. These are the Americans whose lives you're willing to destroy for your own profit. The cameras caught individual faces in the audience. A construction worker who looked betrayed, a small business owner who seemed stunned, a teacher who appeared angry and hurt. These were exactly the working-class Americans that Eric had dismissed so casually on the recording. "You want to know the difference between us, Mr. Trump?" AOC continued, her voice now steady and powerful. "I worked alongside these people. I served them drinks. I listened to their struggles. I understand their challenges because I live them. You see them as marks to be conned." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I became a member of Congress to fight for policies that would help working families because I know what it's like to worry about rent, to choose between groceries and medicine, to work multiple jobs just to survive. You entered politics to protect your family's wealth from the very policies that would help those families." The contrast was stark and devastating. Here was AOC, articulating the experiences of millions of Americans, facing off against Eric Trump, who had just been exposed as viewing those same Americans with contempt. Anderson Cooper attempted to give Eric one final chance to respond. "Mr. Trump, these are serious allegations about your character and your family's business practices. Do you want to address them?" Eric's response was telling in its desperation. "This is all political theater," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My family has done more for this country than people like her could ever understand." "People like me?" AOC's eyebrow raised dangerously. "You mean people who actually work for a living? People who understand what it's like to struggle? People who entered public service to help others rather than to protect their own wealth?" She turned to the cameras again. "This is what we're fighting against in American politics. Not just bad policies, but the cynical assumption that voters are too stupid to understand what's good for them. The arrogant belief that wealthy people have the right to lie to working Americans for their own benefit." The recording had done more than just embarrass Eric Trump. It had exposed the fundamental contempt that many wealthy elites held for ordinary Americans. The casual way Eric had discussed manipulating voters, the dismissive tone he used when talking about working-class struggles, the admission that he knew progressive policies would help people but opposed them anyway for selfish reasons. All of it painted a picture of a political class that viewed democracy as a con game. As the debate officially ended, the studio was still buzzing with energy. Eric Trump gathered his materials quickly, clearly wanting to escape as fast as possible. Gone was the confident businessman who had entered the studio, replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken by what had just occurred. AOC, meanwhile, remained calm and composed, accepting congratulations from audience members and answering questions from reporters who had rushed down from the press gallery. Her performance had been masterful. She had let Eric's own words convict him, using his family's documented contempt for working Americans as the ultimate rebuttal to his claims about economic expertise. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything CNN had ever experienced. Social media exploded with clips of the recording, reaction videos, and analysis of what this meant for American politics. Hashtag Eric Exposed began trending within minutes, followed quickly by hashtag Trump tapes and hashtag AOC wins. Conservative commentators struggled to defend Eric, with many simply refusing to address the content of the recording. Some attempted to claim it was fake, but audio experts who analyzed it quickly confirmed its authenticity. Others tried to argue that private conversations shouldn't be public, but that argument fell flat given that Eric had been publicly claiming to represent working-class interests while privately expressing contempt for those same people. Progressive voices, meanwhile, were celebrating not just AOC's tactical victory, but what it represented. Here was proof of what many had long suspected, that wealthy political figures often privately acknowledge the effectiveness of progressive policies while publicly opposing them for selfish reasons. But perhaps the most important reaction came from the undecided voters and moderate conservatives who had been watching. Many expressed feeling betrayed and disgusted by Eric's casual dismissal of their concerns. The recording had pulled back the curtain on elite political thinking in a way that no policy debate ever could. Within 24 hours, major news outlets were running follow-up stories about the Trump family's business practices, using Eric's own admissions as starting points for deeper investigations. The recording had opened floodgates that the family would struggle to close. Eric Trump attempted damage control with a carefully crafted statement released through his lawyers. The recording played by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was obtained illegally and taken completely out of context. My private conversations do not reflect my public positions or my family's values. This attack on my character is exactly the kind of political theater that Americans are tired of. But the damage was done. The recording was too clear, too damning, and too consistent with patterns of behavior that people had observed from the Trump family for years. The attempt to dismiss it as out of context rang hollow when the context actually made it worse. AOC's response to Eric's statement was swift and devastating. Mr. Trump says these private conversations don't reflect his public positions. That's exactly the problem. When politicians say one thing in public and believe something completely different in private, that's not a defense. It's an admission of dishonesty. She continued, "The American people deserve leaders whose private convictions match their public statements. They deserve representatives who actually believe in the policies they promote." What we heard on that recording was a confession that Mr. Trump views politics as performance art rather than public service. The broader implications of the confrontation extended far beyond the two participants. The recording had exposed something that political scientists had long theorized but rarely been able to prove, that some political figures deliberately promoted policies they knew to be harmful because those policies benefited them personally. It also highlighted the power of authentic political voices like AOC, who had lived the experiences she spoke about rather than simply studying them in business school. The contrast between her genuine understanding of working-class struggles and Eric's casual dismissal of those same struggles had been stark and powerful. For many Americans, the confrontation served as a wake-up call about the importance of vetting political leaders not just on their public statements, but on their fundamental character and motivations. Eric's admission that he deliberately misled voters for personal gain raised questions about how many other political figures might be doing the same thing. The debate also demonstrated the evolving nature of political discourse in the age of social media and portable recording technology. Politicians could no longer assume that their private conversations would remain private, especially when those conversations revealed fundamental dishonesty about their public positions. 3 months after the debate, Eric Trump had largely disappeared from public political discourse. His planned book about conservative economics was quietly canceled, His speaking engagements dried up, and even conservative media outlets seemed reluctant to book him as a guest. The recording had not just embarrassed him. It had effectively ended his political aspirations. AOC, meanwhile, had leveraged the moment to build an even larger platform for progressive economic policies. Her calm, prepared response to Eric's attacks had demonstrated the kind of political skill that many observers believe could take her to the highest levels of American politics. But perhaps the most important outcome was the broader conversation the confrontation had sparked about authenticity in politics. Voters across the political spectrum began demanding that their representatives demonstrate not just rhetorical skill, but genuine belief in the policies they promoted. The Eric Trump recording became a defining moment in American political discourse, a reminder that in the age of technology and social media, politicians' private thoughts had a way of becoming public knowledge. It showed that authentic leaders like AOC, who live their values rather than simply performing them, had significant advantages over those who viewed politics as theater. For working-class Americans who had long suspected that wealthy politicians held them in contempt, the recording provided confirmation of their worst fears. But it also showed them that they had authentic champions like AOC who understood their struggles because she had lived them herself.